We don't have too much time, so I'll start. First of all, I would like to say that I think that this session is there in order to increase the light and optimism because it focuses on things that are very big but also very focused or targeted on schools mainly and the management and staff of the schools and their ability to intervene in the big mass that we know from the statistics about the connection between an economic situation or status and the achievements of the students. So you can't win you can't defeat statistics, but we have given that statistics, we can ask whether the schools can create an internal environment which would mitigate these circumstances. We have a presenter here, and Dr. Rantit Dasmore from USC, and Professor Ron Aviasto from USC as well. Thank you, Rami. So I really hope that my lecture would be able to give some light and optimism. This is a systematic literature review. This review deals with the connections between the school climate, socioeconomic aspects, and inequality, and their linkage to the achievements, to academic achievements. I will try to take you through the methodology, the main findings, and the ramifications of this research to practice and maybe policy as well that derive from each one of the main four chapters of our review. We started from a historical review of the different definitions to a school and class climate and their measurement. The first chapter in our study actually constitutes the foundations of it because it covers all the different dimensions and aspects under the different measurement tools and definitions to this very complex dimension that we don't always know what it is, but it is called the school climate or the class climate. From there, we move over to the thrust of our study, in which we systematically analyze the 81 papers that were published in the past 15 years that analyze the connection between the climate and the socioeconomic status and achievements. The second chapter is involved with the potential contribution of the climate to the achievements, and then the last chapter, the Israeli context, which databases we have in Israel, and given what we've got and the conclusions from the study, what are the directions of research, and we also refer to intervention programs in Israel and what we know about their contribution to the improvement of academic achievements. In order to prepare the first chapter, we reviewed 15 definitions and measurement tools which are mostly used in the literature that were written by the leading researchers about school and class climate in order to really understand this complex dimension of climate that we are interested in. We took the different definitions and measurement tools and we put them into a table that looks like this. This is only one line. You can see here the names of the authors and also the general definition for climate. What is the perspective of measurement in each one of the measurement tools? If it's really a measurement tool, do you measure the climate from the point of view of the student or the staff members, the teachers, from the perspective of the principals, the parents, etc. And we summed up the central criteria in each one of the measurement tools. So what were our conclusions? First of all, we learned that there are significant differences in the definitions for climate and in the way it is measured between the different researchers. And it seems as if there is a lack of consciousness and maybe some confusion in even amongst the researchers, what is a climate, how does it look like, and how can we measure it, and what can we do in order to improve it, in order to support the improvement of school climate. So we want to point at the need to agree upon a uniform definition that could be used in a broad way inside the research niche of a school climate. We also find an indication of the fact that the later definitions of climate are broader in comparison to the earlier ones. We see a process in which, according to the development, the axis of development of the research of climate, we see that more and more dimensions that in the past were not included in the term climate slowly but surely go under this umbrella. Bullying or the feeling of protectedness at school, etc. And despite the fact that the later definitions have the advantage that they are generalistic, they tend to be too exhaustive. So we think that the apt definition should focus only on the very central dimensions of climate, things that can be quantified in figures and also measured. Otherwise, you'll have this feeling that everything is climate. So what distinguishes climate from other dimensions that we measure in schools? Despite these significant differences, we were able to identify three central dimensions of climate that repeat themselves and are a leitmotif in most of the definitions and the measurement tools for for school climate. And these are positive relationships between the teachers and the students, a feeling of protectedness at a school, and the emotional connection of the students to the school and to the class. These are the main dimensions of a climate, and that is how we're going to look systematically for studies that would be contained in the review that I'm going to present to you in a few seconds. But before getting to the main thrust of our study, I would like to say a few words about the connections between these variables. So the findings that were collected all over the world, including Israel, as you can understand, point at a significant positive connection between socioeconomic status and academic achievements, of course, to the debit of students that come from weakened backgrounds. And studies that examine this issue have given an inconsistent pictures. Some studies said that weakened socioeconomic status is necessarily connected to it, and but other studies did not find a connection, a systematic connection between them. And a comprehensive body of studies points at the fact that a positive climate can mitigate the negative contribution as a weakened socioeconomic background has on academic achievements. And here there are a number of different statistical mechanisms. There are studies that pointed at a certain separation or distinguish that saying that a negative background has a negative contribution on the academic achievements, but despite this fact, a positive climate can compensate for the negative contribution of the socioeconomic background and contribute to to higher achievements than would be expected. And some studies pointed at an effect of mediation. This connection between background and achievements result from the connection between background and climate, and the connection between climate and achievement, so that at the end of the day, this connection becomes weaker and weaker. And there also were some studies that pointed at mitigation, that the connection changes according to different levels of climate at school. And this is what can really enable weakened students to get higher achievement. So this is where the literature is situated today. Undoubtedly, the picture is inconsistent and even quite confusing. And given that, we have decided to prepare a systematic literature review that would put some order into this big ocean of information.
For this purpose, we decided to systematically review studies that were reviewed and were published in professional journals, only those that have a high scientific standard and were published over the last 15 years, and focused on examining the links between socioeconomic background, climate, and achievements. For this purpose, we conducted two kinds of searches. The first search, we looked for studies that looked at the links between climate, school climate, and classroom climate, and academic achievements. Of course, we also looked at overlapping words and keywords, as you can see on the slide. This first search gave us 283 um, results, and we chose 31. And since we know that there are many studies that have measured one of the key dimensions that we managed to identify in the first phase, one of the dimensions of climate, but have not used the word climate, we decided to conduct another search whereby we looked for studies that looked at relationships between teachers and students, a sense of security and safety at school, and also the involvement and connection of the student to the school, as well as academic achievements. These are the search words in English. And this second search brought about 704 results, of which we selected 50 relevant studies. So ultimately, our review concludes 81 studies, which we have summarized in table number 1. I want to now demonstrate to you or give you an example of the table that summarizes these 81 studies. This table, of course, is comprised of 81 lines. This is just one line of this table in order to demonstrate to you and let you see our method of work. We showed the source, we showed the method of the study, what sort of was it adaptive, was it longitudinal, was it an experiment, what was the sample, is it representative or not, and we also summarize the indicators for measuring climate and for measuring achievements. And finally, the final column summarizes the findings, the key findings that each one of these studies showed. So you can see, for example, that in this study that was conducted by Wang and Associates in 2014, they showed that a positive school climate has a contribution that can compensate for the negative background from which the student has come. So what are the key findings that emerge from our literature review? First of all, as for the measuring climate measurement perspective, well, even though scholars agree on the importance of measuring climate based on the perspectives and reports of all the school participants, all the people in the school, half of the studies only base themselves on their climate reports of the children, of the students. 6% only included the teachers, 3% of just the parents, and 5% combined between the children's and teachers' reports. And this tendency to focus on one perspective, and primarily the students, and this tendency to neglect the perspective of teachers and parents is very surprising, because we can't really be sure that the children and their parents and teachers experience the same way, the climate the same way, even if we talk about the same school. And therefore, we certainly want to recommend that future studies make sure that climate is assessed from the perspectives of all the school community members, And we know that these systems that envelop the students have an impact and a huge contribution to various outcomes among children, and in this respect, academic achievements as well. As for the unit of analysis, we see that a third of the studies measured climate and achievements only on the student level. This group of studies, in fact, looked at whether a student that personally reports a more positive climate experience also has higher personal academic achievements. And we see that 3% of studies measured climate and achievements only on the school level, and these studies looked at whether a school that has a higher positive level of climate, they can also ach- make achievements on average in the school that are higher. And yet, this tendency to focus only on one level of measurement does not really allow us to understand to what extent the scores and grades of these students are impacted by variables that are on the student level, or perhaps are more impacted by variables that are within the classroom, or maybe on the school level variables. And one of the most prominent studies that ensured that variables are measured on various levels have reached the conclusion that the classroom context is the one that has the greatest effect on the academic achievements of the students. Perhaps the meaning of this is that we need to invest more resources into improving dimensions within the classroom. For instance, by improving the relationship between teachers and students during the lessons. And we will indeed want to recommend the need to have follow up studies that will bring knowledge on the various variables, on the various levels that have to do with academic achievements. As for the system used by the method, by the studies, many were adaptive, and these studies indicate a positive relation between climate and achievements only at one point in time, but they do not allow us to learn about the various effects and the mutual impacts between climate and achievements. A quarter of the studies used were longitudinal or had more than one point of measurement. These studies indeed indicated that positive climate in one point in time is associated with higher achievements in another point in time, but some of these studies also indicated mutual bidirectional links between climate and achievements that don't really let us understand what came first. Did climate bring about an improvement in grades, or perhaps we started from a place of high achievements that led ultimately to an improvement in the school climate or classroom climate? And 3 studies only had a semi experiential method and showed that a positive climate can indeed contribute to the improvement of scores and grades among students. And we again want to recommend that follow up studies shed light on the implications and dynamics between these variables. And finally, I would like to talk about the contribution of climate to academic achievements. We see that more than half of the studies indicate that a positive climate has a contribution that compensates for the weaker negative background of the students, and these findings underscore the importance of improving climate in schools. What's interesting to see is that many of these studies indicate that the same processes of compensation take place in those places where there is a need to improve the academic achievements more urgently. It happens in places where the socioeconomic background is indeed weaker. And this really shows the importance of improving school climates in all schools, but specifically in those that cater to populations that are weaker. And finally, we see that about a tenth of the studies indicate that climate has a moderating effect on the link between socioeconomic status and academic achievements, which means that if the schools have a positive climate actually can level the playing field for these students. Even those who come from a lower background can get to higher academic achievements, higher than we would have expected, seeing as their background is weak, and that is very important. It's a point of it's a positive point. The third kind focused on improving climate and potential contribution to academic achievements. So through our review, we saw indications of interventions that wanted to improve one of the dimensions of climate, like improving the relationships within the school or to increase the sense of safety in the school. And many of these intervention programs were under the umbrella of character education or social emotional learning. And what we did feel is the absence of intervention programs that aim to improve the school climate in general. And we think that has to do with the absence of an acceptable definition of what is a climate. We need to know what a climate is in order to plan intervention, in order to evaluate the intervention and its contribution. Another key point that came up is that intervention programs that were developed locally managed to bring about more remarkable outcomes compared to intervention programs in schools that imported a sort of external model that was proven effective somewhere else. And so we would like to recommend a strategy whereby the people within the school itself, the children, the parents, the teachers, the school principal, they should be the ones to develop an intervention program that will really be custom made for this school and adapted and adjusted to the special needs and issues in these establishments. It seems that the people attending this school, the people who engage and interact with the school, know it best and therefore probably have the key to the best solution. And finally, I would like to focus on what we know about these things here in Israel. From data that is accumulated in Israel, we are able to study the impact between climate and academic achievements. There is an authority for assessing and evaluating schools in Israel. It's called Rama, and it systematically and methodically carries out examinations among a sample of a representative sample of the entire nation from both language sectors, and they don't only accumulate um, data on the subjects, the four core subjects, but also they accumulate data on evaluating the pedagogical and social climate of the schools from the students' perspectives, the teachers' perspectives, the principals' perspectives, and recently also the parents' perspectives. So this really is a database that is very unique and is not similar to anything else in the world, both in terms of um, the scope of data that is being accumulated, but also the variety of data. And this is done in collaboration with some members of the faculty of the academy of the academic world. I am there, also Professor Benbenisty and Professor Glick, and we should really carry out more studies based on this rich data that we have here in Israel. A few directions. There are so many, but you can look at gender differences in the links between climate and academic achievements, and how climate contributes to different subjects, different core areas of study. But we also want to recommend to have a study that will be based on data accumulated over the years that will indicate the impact, the causal impact of climate on academic achievements. And just to sum up, I would also like to talk about the various interventions offered by the psychological service, the most prominent program is the systematic program for promoting climate and reducing violence. And here we really want to point out the need. It would be interesting to see how the implementation of this program has to do with reducing or improving academic achievements among students. So I'd like to thank you for listening. I wrote here questions.